Good morning, everybody. I know this is probably a little weird way to do this, but we're having some technical difficulties in my house. Mainly is my wife's computer because the microphone isn't working on mine. So the way we're going to improvise it today is I posted the PowerPoint to Teams, and in posting the PowerPoint to Teams, I'm hoping you can follow along as I go through some of these notes and concepts that you need to know. Because really, what we're looking at today is the history of psychology, debates in psychology, perspectives in psychology. So I'm going to try to get through as much of this as I can in the allotted time. It's not ideal. Like I was trying to fix the microphone like 5 minutes ago, and just we need to improvise, otherwise you wouldn't be able to hear me at all. So you should open up the PowerPoint that says Psych History and Perspectives, okay, and follow along. You should jot your notes down, or you want to print it out, and do whatever you need to do to encode this material. One thing we'll be talking a lot about second semester, encoding information. So Psych History and Perspectives, psychology is a relatively young social science compared to, say, history or economics and things like that. We've always wondered why people do the things they do, okay, and among other things, we've always asked these big questions. What makes us who we are? We have lots of different answers for that. And one thing you should be aware of is that psychologists don't always agree. So if you look at the second slide, you've got the slide that says big debates in psychology. And the first one on there, and the one that will take up the vast majority of the year, is nature versus nurture. Okay, the idea of nature versus nurture is that, well, are you who you are because of your genes, your heredity, what you've inherited from your parents and grandparents and great grandparents and so forth, or are you who you are because of the way you were raised, your environment? Okay, it's the nurture side of things. So if you think about it this way, my eyes are green, my parents' eyes are both green. As a result, that's clearly a nature sort of thing. Okay, I like history and social studies. My dad likes history and social studies. Is that a nature thing or is that a nurture thing? Is it because I was raised in a house with lots of books about history and psychology and things like that? Is that why I'm interested in it? Or is there some kind of genetic link there? And it's really a combination of both with nature versus nurture. It's more nature and nurture. You see lots of cases like that. I mean, they have done multiple studies on this where they've discovered that identical twins separated at birth. One twin grew up in Maine and became a firefighter, and their identical twin grew up in Denver, Colorado, and grew up to be a firefighter. So maybe there's a little bit of nature on that side. Okay, even though they're raised in totally different environments, they end up being very similar to each other. Maybe nature has sway. Nature and nurture, it's a fascinating subject, and one we're going to spend a lot of time on this year, especially when we get to developmental psychology and biopsychology. Is there a stronger force in influencing who we are? Nature versus nurture. You can talk about mental health this way too. Mental health, how things like depression and obsessive compulsive disorder run in families. Now, does that mean you inherited some kind of chemical imbalance from your parents or grandparents or great grandparents? Or does it mean that being raised in an environment like that, okay, surrounded by somebody else who suffers from depression or anxiety, things like that, you learn to behave that way? Nature versus nurture. So that's debate number one. Debate number two, conscious versus unconscious. And we'll spend some time a little later talking about Sigmund Freud and his idea, but the idea that the mind is an iceberg, according to Sigmund Freud, and you have consciousness at the tip of the iceberg, but really unconscious is the entire bottom of the iceberg. And the question is, which has more of a say in how we behave and how we think? Is it a conscious act on our part or an unconscious act? Are there things beneath the surface that influence the way we behave, the way we act? Okay, that's the question of the unconscious. So, whether it's I don't know, who we end up marrying later in life. Freud has an argument that we end up marrying people who are very similar to our parents. Is it because we have some kind of unconscious feelings of love to people, for your parents, that you then transfer onto other people. I know that sounds kind of weird right now. You probably don't think of marrying your mom or dad, but Freud certainly did. Or is everything conscious level? Is it 100%? You know what you're doing, you know what you're thinking all the time. That's conscious. Person versus situation. Okay, the other debate there. Person versus situation. Are you the same person in every context? Okay, does your personality shift? Does your personality change? Are you one, I could ask kids on my cross-country team, are you one person on the cross-country team? Are you different when you hang out with your friends? I know that was definitely true of me. There was cross-country Mr. Bowden in high school, and there was also church Mr. Bowden, where my dad was the pastor of a United Methodist Church, so yeah, I could not act the same way with my cross-country team as I did with my church, or I couldn't act at church the way I did with the cross-country team. Is that we all strive for consistency. No one wants to be a phony or a fake, but are there situations that influence our personality, or does our personality influence the situation? To give you an example, they had a famous study done at Harvard where they were interviewing a bunch of seminary students. And seminary students are people who are going to be trained to be ministers and priests and things like that. People like my dad went to seminary school. And they said they were discussing the parable of the Good Samaritan, which probably some of you guys remember if you grew up in church and Sunday school. It's the story of a guy who's passed out on the side of the road, been beaten and robbed, and a bunch of people walk by and they don't help him. Then this other guy, the Good Samaritan, comes by and he's kind of rejected by society, but he's the one who helps the person up, and he's the one who clothes him and helps him heal his wounds and gives him food and things like that. Parable of the Good Samaritan. So they're reading this story, and then someone comes in and says, hey, you're wanted across campus at a meeting in 5 minutes. Okay, so they just finished reading this, and seminary students, my own personal bias here, my dad is a wonderful human being. They're good people. Ministers go into the profession to help people, help people with their faith, help people through crisis, things like that. So they sent them across campus one at a time to go to this meeting, and they put somebody passed out on the ground in the way. Almost all of the seminary students, who like I said, personality-wise, are probably pretty good, decent, generous people, almost all of them walked past the guy, even after reading about the Good Samaritan. Okay? And again, it had to do with the situation. They were in a hurry, they had to get to this meeting, somebody else will help that guy who's passed out on the ground. Okay? Does that mean they're bad people? Or is it the situation creating that? That's one of those things we'll talk about, especially in April when we get to social psychology. Does the situation dictate who you become? Or are you the same person no matter what? And finally, the last one on there is stability versus change. Okay, certain psychologists argue that you're pretty much fully formed as a person by the time you're like 8. Okay, or Freud says you are who you are by the age of 15. Piaget says cognitively you fully developed by the age of 12. Okay, is that true? Okay, do we continue to develop throughout our lives? That's the change part. Do we continue going through personality changes? Maybe your parents, if they've had something that psychologists refer to as a midlife crisis, would they get referred to as a generativity versus stagnation crisis in Erikson's stages? Do personalities continue to change? Do you continue to change? I'm sure if I asked you the question, if we were in person, I'd say, are you the same person you were in 7th grade? And most of you would say no. But are there core elements of that personality that carry through no matter what? Okay, so these are some of the things that psychologists like to discuss, like to debate, and things that we'll be talking about throughout the year. So that, in about 10 minutes, that's your first slide of the PowerPoint, what I would be presenting to you on WebEx if my microphone was working. And, I have to give my computer back in a little bit, but I'm going to be posting another video on the history of psychology in a few minutes. So I'll post that, and I'll probably be seeing you guys, check you in on WebEx. We'll see how this goes. Thanks.